Howdy, Ags. Great to welcome you to a special Scowcroft Institute event. I'm very grateful to Andrew Natsios for allowing me the honor of introducing a very good friend and colleague over many years, Steve Pifer. Steve and I guess, first worked together closely in that immediate period following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and sorting out all kinds of issues in the post-Soviet space, most notably between Ukraine and Russia. Very interesting in those days and remains so to this day. So, and my admiration for Steve's wisdom, his skills as a negotiator, and his commitment to public service has only continued to build in the ensuing couple of decades. He has served in virtually every important department of the U.S. government involved with the issues that he wants to talk about today, nuclear arms reduction, including the National Security Council, where he was assistant to the President and Senior Director. He was also an Assistant Secretary of State in the State Department in those in the realm of arms reduction and security issues, and also U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. Steve has published in virtually every important journal in the field and in lots of popular publications, and is also a TV personality. Everything's from Fox News to CNBC, so you can see his the diversity of interest in what he's got to say. He has a great new book on this subject, the opportunity, next steps in reducing nuclear arms. And so, without taking any more of his time, let's give a great Fighting Texas Aggie welcome to Steve Pifer.
Hello, thank you very much for that warm and overly generous introduction. I should also say it was a real pleasure working with Larry, and by all appearances, he's made the transition from the State Department back to Texas Aggie land with flying colors. I will say one thing that Larry didn't admit is that he was actually the last director of the Office of Soviet Union Affairs in the Department of State. So he's actually the one who broke it. Anyway, I'm delighted to be down here to talk about nuclear arms control. Most of my talk will be based on a book that my colleague Michael Hanlon at Brookings and I wrote last year called The Opportunity, Next Steps in Reducing Nuclear Arms. And I'll begin by saying that first, you don't do arms control for the sake of arms control. You do it because it's an important part of your national security toolkit. And at the end of the day, you do it because you think it makes the United States more safer and secure and improves global nuclear security. And I'll break my talk down into three pieces after I give just a quick introduction as to where we are. First, why arms control makes sense, why we ought to be pursuing more of it. Second, what are some of the opportunities that I think are out there? And then third, what are some of those challenges that might inhibit our ability to realize the opportunities? So let me just start by saying, in fact, over the last several decades, we've actually made quite a bit of success in reducing nuclear weapons. This was the U.S. Nuclear Stockpile from 1945 up until 2010. And in the 1960s, we hit a peak of about 33,000 nuclear weapons. Today it's down. The U.S. stockpile is estimated to be about 4,500 to 4,700 weapons in the stockpile, not counting those weapons that are now retired and awaiting dismantlement. And we're making more progress with the New START treaty that was signed in 2010 by President Obama, and then Russian President Medvedev. That treaty, the limits take full effect in 2018, and these are the three limits. Each side will be constricted to 700 deployed strategic delivery vehicles. That's deployed missiles, deployed bombers. 800 bombers and launchers, the launchers counting ICBM silos and counting tubes on submarines. And then what I think is the most important here, 1,550 deployed strategic warheads. Now, President Obama has said he'd like to go beyond this. At his speech he gave in Berlin in June, he said he would like to reduce this number by about a third, to bring the number of U.S. and Russian deployed warheads down to about 1,000 to 1,100. So why does it make sense to go further? And I'll give you 4 or 5 reasons that I think are important. First of all, we've made a lot of progress in reducing strategic arms. 1,550 warheads is way below what we had in the 1980s when the United States and the Soviet Union probably had 8,000 to 10,000 deployed strategic nuclear weapons range. But you have to ask, does this number really make sense 20 years after the end of the Cold War. And I would argue that as a general proposition, the more that we can reduce this number, that means fewer Russian nuclear weapons pointed at the United States, which I would argue would be a good thing. The second reason, though, is that if you look at the New START Treaty, it only covers a subset of the nuclear arsenal. It only covers deploying strategic weapons. This gives you a more fuller picture of where the United States and Russia are. So New START limits just this number up here. This number here, non-strategic tactical weapons, is an area where the Russians have a pretty significant advantage. 2,000 to 500. Some estimates say that the Russians may be actually 6 to 8 times as much as the United States. But it's hard to see how we're going to change that number without arms control. Likewise, when you get to reserve strategic weapons, that's an area the United States has an advantage. Again, arms control would be a way to address that number. So if he's going to be able to move beyond just focusing as deployed warheads, the non-strategic arsenals, which is something that the Senate has asked the administration to do, it's something very important for our allies in Europe and Asia. Arms control is probably going to be a big part of that answer. Another reason to do arms control is transparency. This is the numbers. Every 6 months, the United States and Russia exchange a huge amount of data. And by agreement, they release the top line numbers. So these numbers were actually put out 2 days ago. This is from the September 1 data exchange. And here you see each of the limits, and you see where the United States and Russia are. Now, bear in mind, they don't have to hit these limits until February of 2018. And actually, on the American side, these two numbers here went up. Now, that probably reflects the fact that the ballistic missile submarine may have come back online. So the numbers may go up or down, but by February of 2018, both sides have to be at 1550. Now, on transparency, where transparency is valuable is with our national technical means of verification, satellites, things like that, we have a really good idea about how many ICBM silos the Russians have, how many submarines, and how many deployed missiles. We don't yet have a system that can look through a missile silo door, through a nose cone, and count warheads on individual missiles. And we get this number from arms control. Because when an American inspection team shows up at a Russian ICBM base, the Russians have to, by treaty, give them a list of every specific deployed missile and the number of warheads in each one of those missiles. And that gives us a lot more information about the Russian force that we wouldn't get otherwise. And that's valuable for the military because we then avoid worst-case assumptions and we can make smarter decisions about how we equip our own strategic forces. Another reason for arms control is cost savings. The United States is at a point where they're now considering how do you recapitalize the strategic triad. So, for example, the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine down here, that first submarine will be retired in 2029. We have to begin building a new submarine probably around 2021. Right now, the estimate that the new submarine will cost about $6 billion per boat. That does not include the cost of missiles or torpedoes. The Navy hopes to lower that cost, but the history of Navy shipbuilding the last 20 years is those costs are only going to go up. The Air Force would like a new penetrating bomber. They're pricing that at $550 million apiece. And there's also a question about whether the Minuteman ICBM, I think on the Minuteman ICBM, the answer will be to extend the life of the current ICBMs. That may be the cheapest option. But you have a lot of very expensive systems here. And if arms control brings the numbers down, we may be able in the future to build fewer systems, which won't save money in the near term, but in the 2020s could be pretty useful, given I don't think we're going to have the defense budget pressures that we're seeing now go away anytime soon. And then the last reason I would argue is arms control is worthwhile in arms reduction is for our credibility in terms of arguing against nuclear proliferation. Even when the New START Treaty is fully enforced, the United States and Russia between them will still control about 90 to 95% of the nuclear weapons in the world. And unless the United States is seen as working to reduce its nuclear weapons levels, it's awfully hard to go to China and say you shouldn't build up when China has less than 300 weapons, or to go to Iran and say you can't acquire a nuclear weapon. Now, I'm going to be realistic about this. If the United States and Russia sign a new treaty tomorrow, that's not going to cause a change overnight to either North Korea or Iran. But where it does work is with third countries. If the United States is reducing its arsenal, it has greater credibility diplomatically with third countries, and you can get those countries to pressure proliferators. So the New START Treaty was signed in 2010 and entered into force in 2011. And since then, you've seen much greater diplomatic success by the United States in terms of getting other countries to apply meaningful economic sanctions on Iran. And I don't think this two are disconnected. So those are some of the reasons why I think arms control makes sense for U.S. national security. Let me talk about 3 or 4 of the opportunities. And the first opportunity would be to reduce U.S. and Russian nuclear weapons below current levels. President Obama, when he was in Berlin, he called for reducing that 1,550 level down by a third. He also called for what he said bold reductions in tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons. Now, it's not quite clear how those numbers relate, and I think there's a difference involving the use administration. In 2011, when you talked about what the State Department, Defense Department, what they had in mind then was what we called a big treaty. And that would be a treaty that would cover deployed strategic weapons, reserve strategic weapons, and non-strategic. So you basically take everything in the U.S. and Russian arsenals and put them on the table. And what they were interested in was this idea of having a single limit that would cover everything, perhaps with one or two subsidy limits. That was the idea in 2011. This shows what it might look like. Now, the numbers are not from USCO, the numbers are the numbers that Michael came up with. But the idea would be the United States and Russia, each of them is between 2,000 to 2,500 total nuclear warheads. That would be about a 50% cut in current arsenals. You keep a subsidy here at 1,000 deployed strategic weapons. And that's because these are the weapons of greatest concern. Most of those are on intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles and can be launched in a matter of minutes. Those are the weapons you worry about the most, and you would want to make sure we're especially constrained. Now, what that aggregate limit does, and I'll show you a chart that explains how I think this happens, is it forces a trade-off. If you remember originally in that chart that showed total numbers, the Russians had a big number advantage in non-strategic weapons. The American side had a big advantage in reserve strategic weapons. This aggregate limit forces the trade-off, and I'll show you how that works. And then you might bring down the number of deployed bombers and missiles from 700 down to about 500. The trade-off works like this, and basically the columns, first and third column are the United States and Russia now, and then the second and fourth columns are what would happen after the treaty. This presupposes an aggregate limit of 2,000 weapons. The red bar here is the number of deployed strategic warheads, so each side can go down to 1,000 with a subsidy limit. This tan bar here is the number of non-strategic weapons. And what you see in this aggregate unit is the Russians make a significant reduction in their numerical advantage in non-strategic weapons, although at the end of the day, they still keep more. The United States makes a significant reduction in its advantage in reserve strategic weapons, although at the end of the day, it still has more. It has the advantage each side gets to choose its force mix, but that aggregate limit is the mechanism that forces that trade-off between the areas of the two sides that get respective advantages. And it does it in a way that if you were talking about non-strategic weapons by themselves, how do you persuade the Russians to give up an advantage? If you're talking about reserve strategic weapons by themselves, how do you persuade the Americans to get the advantage? The aggregate limit becomes the vehicle to do that. Now, in the last 7 or 8 months when you talk to the administration, they're less interested in this idea. And I think the concern is that they've looked at a treaty like this and they said, you're going to get into new classes of weapons that have not been limited before. It's going to take time, and it's going to take probably longer than the Obama administration still has in office. So what they're talking about now is sort of different approaches to different classes of systems. And this is an illustrative approach. What you might do is have one track that focuses on deployed strategic weapons, and their second track that would be doing reserve strategic. And again, I want to keep these two clumps together because one area is a Russian advantage, the other is an American advantage. That creates a trade-off possibility. On that first track, if you had a meeting of minds between Washington and Moscow, that could actually be done fairly quickly. The sides say agreed, let's reduce down to 1,000 deployed strategic warheads, 500 deployed missiles and bombers. Basically, all you have to do is take the New START treaty and change the numbers. The counting rules, the definitions, the verification measures all work under lower numbers. So you wouldn't have to do a lot of new ground. That can be done fairly quickly. This area here probably is going to take longer. And what you hear from Russians is that if they start down this track, they're going to want to start first with transparency and confidence-building measures. Confidence-building measure might be an agreement to do what both sides appear to do anyway, which is keep warheads for non-strategic systems off of the release systems. Maybe you consolidate them in a number of storage sites, and then later on in a later phase move to numerical limits. So you might have two tracks, but the tracks perhaps would proceed in different cases. But the opportunity here is whether you go for the big treaty or these two different tracks. So I think there's an opportunity out there for the United States and Russia to make a significant reduction, about 50% in their nuclear arsenals. That would still leave them, though, probably 6 to 7 times larger than the third country. So you would still have the United States and Russia as the two top dogs in nuclear weapons. Now, the next area where I think there's some opportunity for progress and for cooperation would be the question of missile defense. And the Russians have basically argued that they are uncomfortable. They don't want to reduce further nuclear weapons unless there is some kind of resolution between the United States and Russia over missile defense. And what the Russians have said is they need to have a treaty that would limit American missile defenses, that would assure them that American missile defenses were not directed against Russian strategic forces. Now, I think the Russians have a point. The Russians are perfectly right in principle. if you have limits, equal limits on strategic offensive forces, and one side were to radically build up its missile defenses, it could undermine that strategic offensive balance. But where I think the Russians are wrong is, at this point in time, you don't have that threat. And that's because the gap between strategic offense and strategic defense is huge. Under the New START Treaty in February of 2018, the United States and Russia can each have 1,550 deployed strategic warheads. At that point in time, if the maximum American time is realized, the United States will have 44 interceptors that would have the speed to engage a strategic warhead. 44 against 1,550. That's not, to my mind, a credible threat. So I think later on there might be a valid argument for tighter limits on missile defense. But right now I think you can get by with lesser steps. Transparency measures. The United States has offered the Russians an executive agreement that would basically have each side lay out its missile defense plans for 5 to 10 years in advance. So the other could say, okay, I understand what the other guy is doing on missile defense. Is that a threat to my strategic forces or not? If the Russians can move past this demand for a legally binding guarantee, it may open up some possibilities, first of all, to resolve differences, but maybe even to realize something that NATO leaders discussed with the Russian president back in 2010, which is this idea of a cooperative NATO-Russian missile defense for Europe. And it's interesting because there have been, in early 2011, there were official discussions between the Department of Defense and the Russian Ministry of Defense. What does a cooperative missile defense system look like? And in parallel, there were at least 3, maybe 4 track 2 discussions, unofficial discussions, that also looked at this question. And all of these dialogues pretty much came up with a variety of these ideas. First of all, you'd want to have transparency. NATO and Russia would have to understand what the other side's missile defense capabilities were in order to make a cooperative missile defense system work. Second, joint exercises would be a great way to promote cooperation. Take a NATO military unit and a Russian unit, put them together, and have them exercise jointly so each can understand how the other deals with missile defense challenges. And in fact, this is, we've been doing, the United States and Russia have done missile defense exercises jointly for more than a decade, and NATO and Russia have done them over the last 5 years. So there's already a certain amount of experience here. A third point was, in the unofficial dialogues and the official dialogues, they pretty much reached agreement, you can't have a single system with one commander. And that boils down to Russia's not going to work for NATO and NATO's not going to work for Russia. So the idea would be 2 separate systems, a NATO missile defense headquarters, a Russian missile defense headquarters, where they would find various ways to interact. And the interactions would be primarily through 2 jointly manned missile defense centers. One idea was a data fusion center, where you would have a place where you have NATO and Russian military officers working side by side. They would receive real-time data from American and NATO early warning sensors, early warning tracking data. They would receive the same information from the Russian side. That's actually of interest to us because the radar that happens to have the best view of Iran happens to be a Russian radar. The center would take that data, combine it, and then in near real time send the combined product back to the NATO missile defense headquarters and the Russian missile defense headquarters. So each side would have the benefit of the enhanced data and have a better picture of the environment around Europe. The second idea was for a joint planning and operations area. This would be a place where NATO and Russian military officers would talk about what sorts of threats do you worry about. In the case of NATO now, the first focus would be on Iranian ballistic missiles. Second, what are the attack scenarios that you're designing in your defenses to stop? And then third, what would be sort of the rules of engagement? How would you actually behave if you saw an incoming ballistic missile attack? And one of the reasons that you would want to do this is that, say you had a missile coming into a space that's sort of in both the NATO and Russia areas, and you want to have the sides using procedures so that if they both decided to engage that incoming warhead, their interceptors in fact engaged the warhead and did not engage each other and allow the warhead a free ride. So I think with a political decision in Moscow, there's an opportunity to take missile defense, remove it as a problem issue, remove it as a blockade to further nuclear reductions discussions, and perhaps even make it a cooperative element in NATO-Russian relations. The third area that there's an opportunity, although I think this is really a long shot, particularly given the difficult environment we now see between the White House and the Congress, and that is to move forward on ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, or the CTBT, was signed in 1996. It bans all nuclear tests anywhere. The administration, sought ratification, or sought approval for ratification by the Senate in 1999, and basically it failed. And it failed for 2 reasons. One, and these were very understandable reasons. One, the Senate said, if we can't test, how do we maintain confidence in the reliability of the U.S. nuclear arsenal? And second, if we have this test ban, how do we know that somebody else isn't out there cheating? And I think very understandable questions. What's been in place since then is basically a moratorium. No country in the world has tested with the exception of North Korea. But there would be an advantage of bringing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty into force in terms of raising that political bar against testing. And there are some countries, China, for example, has basically said once the United States moves, China would move. And that would be, I think, a very positive impulse. I would argue that now, if you go back and you look at those few questions in 1999, in fact, we have very good answers. Over the last 13 years, we've had the Stockpile Stewardship Program, which basically has the national labs doing things like computer simulations, other tests short of nuclear explosions to understand how nuclear weapons work. And the directors of the national labs, Lawrence Livermore, Sandia, and Rosales, have basically said that we can now and for the foreseeable future be confident in the reliability of our nuclear weapons without having to have nuclear tests. And in fact, what they've actually said also is that in some of these experiments they worked out, we've actually understand how nuclear weapons explosions work better. We've learned more than we learned from nuclear testing. So there's a pretty good answer on that question. The second question gets to verification, and not only has there been improvement in American national technical means, but the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization has built a network of ultimately about 300 sensors around the world. And this shows basically the picture where they're all going to be. It's about 85% operational now. It includes seismic sensors to detect nuclear tests in the ground. It includes hydrophone stations in the ocean to detect the nuclear test in the water. It includes sensors to hear the test in the atmospheric test to detect the radionuclide byproducts that might be produced by a test. And although it's very hard to get the CTBTO people to say something formally, when you talk to them unofficially, they say, with this network, they're very confident they can detect a test anywhere in the world of 1 kiloton. And moreover, when we look at certain geologies like North Korea, where the Russian test sites have been, the Chinese test sites, the geology there is such that they think they can detect the test of those sites down to 0.1 to 0.2 kilotons. For point of comparison, the weapons used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were about 12 to 20 kilotons each. So we're pretty much at a point now where we can be very confident that any militarily significant test is going to be detected. And for a first-time entrant in the nuclear arena, they're unlikely to do a small test, because those small tests are actually harder to do than the larger test. And for purposes of a first-timer, are probably not going to have to do that. So again, the answer on this side is much better than it was in 1999. I give two other reasons why I think the test ban makes sense. First of all, the U.S. test site, now called the Nevada National Security Site, it's called the Nevada Test Site, is about 70 miles north of Las Vegas. I visited Las Vegas. I was at the university there for about a week last year, and I asked people about this. And folks basically said, look how hard we fought against storing nuclear waste at the old test site. Do you really think that Nevada would politically accept the resumption of testing? And he also pointed out that the population of Las Vegas is now 3 times what it was in 1992 at the time of the last test. So I think politically, if you look at it, I don't see other states that would be very eager to accept the test site. It's very hard politically to see the United States ever conducting a nuclear test again. And we ought to play like other countries on that. The last reason I would argue is that if you look at the number of nuclear explosions, with the exception of 2, most of all the rest of the West, the United States has done as much as the rest of the world combined. It's not only doing numerically more, but it's how we did tests. In 1988, when I was at the American Embassy in Moscow at the Arms Control Portfolio, we did what was called the Joint Verification Experiment, where Americans could be on site when the Soviets did a test of Sunny polytubes, and they could be on site at Nevada when we did a test. And I took an advanced team out there about 6 months ahead of time, and they took us out to the test place where they drilled a hole that's about 3 feet diameter, we got about 1,200 Pifer and upcoming into the test. And one of the guys from Nevada says, boy, these guys are going to be surprised when they get from Nevada. And I said, why is that? He says, well, when we do a vertical shaft for a test, we typically drill the shaft 10 to 12 feet in diameter. And that puzzled me. And I said, well, why would you do that? I mean, the modern weapons are not that big. He says, it's not about the size of the weapon. It's about maximizing the surface area above the weapon so you can put as many instruments as possible. So not only were we doing more tests, we were collecting more data. And I would argue that this ought to be the real reason for doing the test ban is we ought to freeze this as an area of American advantage and lock anybody else into the fact that they don't know as much about how nuclear weapons work as we do. So there's an opportunity here. Again, I think this is a long shot because the relationship between the White House and Congress is not particularly good. And ultimately, the biggest, of course, first go to the Senate. One last area of opportunity to talk about would be multilateralization of the nuclear reductions process. This shows the number of nuclear weapons held by the 9 countries that have them. I think with these numbers, clearly the United States and Russia still bear primary responsibility to lead on nuclear reductions. But the nuclear arms control, the nuclear reductions process cannot remain forever just a process done by the Americans and Russians. So the question is, could you reach out to some other countries? Now we'll start with France, China, and Britain. And maybe could you ask them, look, we're not asking you to make reductions, we're not asking you to enter a legally binding agreement, but could you do 2 things? One would be a transparency arrangement where you at least disclose the total number of weapons that you have, because these are all estimates. And then the second thing is not to enter a treaty, but to make a unilateral political commitment that as long as the United States and Russia are coming down, you won't go up. And again, there may be an opportunity if Washington and Moscow get their act together to work to try to persuade the other 3 countries, and then use things like the upcoming review conference on non-proliferation in 2015 to begin to pressure to begin to expand this process just beyond the bilateral one between Washington and Moscow. So those are some opportunities. Let me just talk very briefly about challenges which might hinder our ability to realize these. And the first challenge, and I think by far the biggest challenge, is the Russians. Are the Russians prepared to negotiate? The last year or so, they've showed very little interest in further nuclear reduction. When the White House announced in August that it was canceling the planned bilateral summit scheduled for September in Moscow, one reason they said was the Russians had not responded to any of our offers on nuclear reductions. Now, I try to be optimistic. I think there may be a couple of why Russians might want to come back to the table. This goes back to that chart I showed you earlier, and what you can see here is, if you look at these limits, the Russians have already met 2 of the limits. The United States military is in a position now with its current force structure, the missiles and bombers, it can stay at 700 and 1550 for the life of the New START treaty without having to build a single new system. You can do that probably until 2030. The Russians can't. The Russians have a lot of aging systems. They're building new submarines, they're building new missiles for their submarines, they're building new intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they have to do that just to maintain these numbers. But most expect that these numbers are going to go down further in the next several years. So one option for the Russians to do would be to reduce how much money they invest in these systems and accept a negotiation for lower limits, and they could save some economic, they could relieve some of the burden on their defense budget. The second reason I think that the Russians might want to go back into arms control is this number here. Is not only do the American side have an advantage in reserve strategic weapons, but most of our missiles, if not all of our missiles, have been downloaded so they carry fewer warheads than they were designed to do so. If the treaty were to break down under a crisis, the U.S. military has the possibility to put a large number of these, maybe 1,000, 1,200 of these warheads, back onto intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles in the force. The Russians don't have a comparable capability, and that bothers some on the Russian military side. So there may be a couple of reasons for the Russians to think about, yes, getting back to an arms control dialogue makes sense, although I have to concede that at this point in the last year, you haven't seen that. And there's some speculation that for the Russians, you go back to this chart here, the Russians like this chart because that's their strongest claim to being the superpower on par with the United States. A second challenge to an arms program would be verification. Is New START, the intelligence community says that they have high confidence in their ability to monitor New START limits, including the limit on deployed strategic warheads. And that's made easier to do because deployed strategic warheads are on intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Those are big, they're fairly easy to know where they are. If you start talking about limiting non-strategic weapons, which are not on delivery systems, or reserve strategic weapons, you're talking about going in places like this, in the storage areas, and counting weapons. That's not an impossible task to solve, but it's going to require that both the U.S. and Russian militaries get in the area and perhaps pushes them beyond their comfort zone. So that'll be a challenge. And I think then the third challenge I would say is the U.S. Senate. If the President does another arms control treaty, the U.S. Senate has to approve that treaty for ratification by a 2/3 vote. And I think it's fair to say that Republicans in the Senate tend to be fairly skeptical about arms control, or more skeptical than the President about arms control, even if you set aside the current nonsense that's going on between the White House and Congress today on sequestration and the budget. And so I think the administration is thinking about if they were to do another agreement with the Russians, I think they're actively considering the possibility of doing it in a mechanism other than a treaty, because they're not confident that any treaty that they could do would have a chance of being approved by the Senate for ratification. I think those are the three big challenges. When I look at it right now, I have to say, I think the challenges are pretty hard to overcome. If you look at nuclear reductions and the possibility of missile defense cooperation, it's uncertain how far the Russians are prepared to go. Right now, you don't have a lot of grounds for optimism. That could change in 6 to 12 months, so I think we want to keep pushing, but right now it's not clear that they're ready to do this. On the question of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, that's going to depend a lot on White House congressional relations, which I think are in a difficult strait, so I'm not completely confident on that. So at this point, when you look at those challenges, this is a pretty significant barrier to overcome. I think it makes sense, though, to keep pushing at these things, because if you could legalize some of these opportunities, at the end of the day, you're going to be in a safer and secure position, both for the United States and for the world. And it's unfortunate we have those obstacles, but hopefully in the coming months, we can find a way to get around them and begin to realize some of the opportunities that are out there. At that point, why don't I stop, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Floor is open.
Given the arms race going on between India and Pakistan, especially with Pakistan rapidly increasing its plutonium production capability, at what point do you see that starting to concern the Chinese?
Yeah.
And at some point, I mean, in your book you say that there's basically room for maybe one more bilateral agreement, and then it has to become multilateral. How do you see that playing into this in the future?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I would like to see one more bilateral agreement. We bring the U.S. and Russia down to about here. And what I've heard from talking to Russians is that they think that, these are non-official Russians, their view is that Moscow could probably go down to 1,000 deployed strategic warheads without having third countries involved, although that there would have to be something in the form of numerical limits on at least 50 times in China. Pakistan probably doesn't figure into that equation just yet. My guess is the Russians would be happy broadening that process just to bring in the other three countries at first. But I think we do have to worry about Pakistan, because by some projections, Pakistan is on a course to be perhaps the third largest nuclear power if they realize the sorts of production capabilities that they're talking about, and in fact do begin to produce those amounts of plutonium and such. Now, there are decent relations between China and Pakistan, but I think where this gets to the Chinese is how do the Indians react? Right now you have rough equivalence between India and Pakistan in nuclear weapons numbers. If the packs begin to build up at a fairly rapid rate, does India then try to match that? And then how do the Chinese react? So you've got that triangle there. I mean, you've got, this is where it's kind of interesting if you look at it. There's two triangles here, both of which figure with China. You have India, Pakistan, and China, and then you have the United States, Russia, and China. And so getting those things to align is not going to be easy. I would say if we could bring in France, China, and Britain originally, that would be a good step. And then once you have that, then maybe the next step is to bring the other countries in.
Sort of related to that question, you discussed the U.S. and Russia decreasing their stockpiles to gain credibility with third parties to pressure Iran and the DPRK. How do you think that the U.S. and Russia could influence countries like India and Pakistan who have security concerns right on their border to do the same and to stay low in future conflicts?
Yeah, I think the tools with them are going to be, and I think the administration, both this administration, the Bush administration, did that, and tried to find ways to help India and Pakistan find the solution to the underlying problems. I mean, I think that's probably, if you get those two countries more comfortable about the fact that they border one another, that might reduce the pressure that each feels to build up its nuclear weapons levels. If you look over the last 10 years, though, I'm not sure that we've been as successful as we would like to have.
Thanks for coming and thanks for your service. You mentioned the defense budget and the sequestration. Do you think possibly maybe one of the reasons why the Russians don't want to come to the negotiating table for a new treaty is because they believe that the United States is going to make unilateral cuts in the nuclear stockpile, and they're going to wait for that to happen first before they go through.
That may be. I mean, and this has been one of, as I think Larry can attest, one of the real problems dealing with Russians is Americans culturally, and it's the business side culture. We see a deal, we want to get it done, let's go, 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 go. And the Russians are very comfortable with, well, no, maybe not quite. And the Russian, if we're not careful, we can get into a situation where we negotiate with ourselves. And the Russians are only overjoyed to see us come in with better and better offers. So, yeah, I think that there's always that risk the Russians will do that. But again, I look at the numbers now, and it seems that the Russians are really heading to a situation where Russian analysts say that they're headed down now to maybe a level of 1,000 to 1,100 warheads. And they'll have to go back up. Because they have a problem where basically the bulk of their weapons on land-based systems are on SS-18s and SS-19s. All of those missiles are past their shell dates. They're now building to replace submarines where they have an interesting system with their current boats. They basically, for most of the last 10 years, whereas U.S. Navy puts probably anywhere to 35 to 60% of their boats are at sea at any one time, the Russians conducted most of their deterrent patrols at dockside. City and port, very, very vulnerable. And I think that reflected the fact that, older boats that they have a need to build these new systems on. The question for them that they have to consider is, do they want to build 10 boats? Would they get by with 8 boats? Do they want to build 200 new missiles? Could they get by with 150 missiles? So I think the calculation that they need to be making is, do they really want to pour a lot of resources into these systems at a time where I think their military is slowly beginning to recognize, what I think the U.S. military has recognized for about 20 years, is that nuclear weapons aren't very useful for things other than nuclear deterrence. And that they don't translate into gains and other, we still had to fight a war with Iraq back in 1991. Nuclear weapons didn't stop that. And so the question of the Russian military is, they begin to see that nuclear weapons really aren't all that valuable, and they have to ignore their resources into the sort of advanced conventional capabilities I think set the U.S. military apart now. We'll see about that. I had this discussion. One of my colleagues at Brookings says that I'm wrong on this. He says what I have to realize is this is not about the Russians building missiles and submarines for purposes of matching the United States. It's about creating jobs. And his argument is that if you're Vladimir Putin and you saw what happened in 2011 and you saw the demonstrations and you look at opinion polls, you basically lost the middle class in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So where's your constituency? It tends to be outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, including in a lot of these towns that are one-plant towns that are basically building weapons. So he argues it's not about strategic relations with the United States, it's about these people employed so that he has a political constituency that supports him. And that's one of the things that complicates arms control.
Thank you, sir.
Hey, sir, my question may seem a little bit elementary, but within the realm of verification, I know a satellite can fly over or whatever collection activities we have and look at a missile base and see that, yep, there's a missile in the silo. But with regards to MIRV warheads, how effective is that really in knowing how many warheads are deployed?
Sure.
And when the inspection team goes to the missile base, they may get a list of what is supposedly deployed there, but do they go out to the entire missile field? And
no, that's a really good question. The United States and Russia can each do, they're called Type 1 inspections. You can do 10 a year at either ICM bases or at submarine, missile submarine ports. Russian team arrives, say, at Dulles and decides to go out and visit an ICBM field. When they arrive there, within like 2 hours, they're given a list that says, this is every deployed ICBM at this field. And it'll say like, okay, Minuteman 3, Silo Mike 7, 1 warhead. And they get that list. They then get to choose one of those things and go immediately there to verify that in fact the number is correct. Now, that's not counting everything, but basically when the two militaries were working through these procedures and negotiations, the question was, on the one hand, how do you create enough inspections that create a significant enough risk of detection that the other side won't cheat, while at the same time minimizing your operational impact of day-to-day operations? And it would be hugely disruptive if you had a Russian inspection team and they said, okay, they get to go look at all 150 sites. It would take days and such. And I'll give you an example. When the Russian inspection team shows up at Dulles Airport, which is their port of entry, and they say they want to go to Kings Bay, Georgia, which is where the Atlantic ballistic missile submarines are based. Within an hour, things happen at Kings Bay. submarines can't leave, submarines can't, enter, big vehicles have to stop moving until the inspection is conducted. So what they try to do here, and it creates a certain risk of cheating, but they try to find that mix between, on the one hand, minimizing the impact of day-to-day operations, and also creating enough detection enough risk of cheating, detecting cheating that the other side won't. And 10 inspections seems to be what the sides are pretty comfortable with. You also have, once you get that data sheet, because you get to take the data sheet home, so then you have that information on the number of warheads on each individual ICBM, you can then queue up your satellites then to watch the field and say, when they start changing things out. So you're never going to have a perfect real-time picture, but as a result now of inspections, I think we've done 10 inspections in this year. This is the third for the year, so I think we've done 30 inspections. We've got a pretty good history now of information on Russian strategic forces that gives us a pretty good idea of what they're doing.
Steve, you, at one point in the Bush administration anyway, was strongly backing the idea of the reliable replacement warhead.
Yeah.
To replace some of these older warheads in the U.S. stockpile with new warheads that could be indefinitely into the future verified without having tested.
Yeah.
I don't see, the administration seems to have backed way off of that. And I wonder, is that simply a political preference, or is it more the improvements in modeling and simulation that accounts for that?
Well, it actually was killed by Congress in 2005 and 2006. I think the theory of Congress was that it was not interested in just having a reliable replacement warhead, but also adding some new capabilities like a ground penetrating capability. What the administration, this administration said in its 2010 nuclear posture review was that it would rely on renovation. There are sort of 3 R's. But basically, the idea is that you will take weapons, you will extend their life to the extent possible. If you have to replace it into the parts, you'll do that. But you'll do that without giving the weapon new military capabilities. So, for example, they're just now getting ready to do the B-61 gravity bomb, where they're going to have to go in and update parts of the nuclear package. But in some cases, this bomb still has vacuum tubes in it. So a lot of the non-nuclear parts will be updated and such. But the idea, what the administration policy says, at the end of the day, that weapon should not have new military capabilities compared to the old B-61. And that fits in with the administration's view that it wants to move away from reliance on nuclear weapons and overall security policy. Mike and I thought a little bit about the reliable replacement warhead, and there is a question I think out there. I would not totally rule it out. And the question will become at the end of the day is, when you do these life extension programs, they're not cheap. The B-61 bomb, Sandia and Los Alamos say it'll cost $70 billion to do probably about 400 bombs. One estimate is out there is $10 billion. At some point, these things become really, really expensive in times when the budget's critical. And so one of the questions might be is the cost of the modeling the life extensions is reach a point where actually having a reliable replacement warhead might make more sense. And you could go back to an old design, you could increase your engineering margins. One of the things that we're doing is we have weapons that were built and designed in the 70s and 80s where you wanted to maximize the amount of explosive force per weight. Well, you can say now, well, we don't need to have that much explosive force, so we can cut back, we can put UHE or plutonium in the weapon, we can do things so that we're more confident that it'll work. The big question is, could you do that without testing? Right. And sometimes they say, yeah, they say we can take a design off the shelf, we can build that weapon, and we can tell you that's going to work just because we understand it. And others will say, yeah, maybe, but I'd really like to test it. That would be a problem, at least for this administration, because its policy is that we're not testing. So far, they appear to be on the course now of doing life extension programs. What they would like to do, although I think the services are not yet fully on board, we now have basically 7 nuclear weapons types in the arsenals: 2 for intercontinental ballistic missiles, 2 for submarine-launched ballistic missiles, 2 for aircraft, and 1 for an air-launched cruise missile. They would like to basically go from 7 types down to 5. And for ballistic missiles, basically have 3 warheads that can be interchangeable. So you can take a lot of the reason that we keep the extra warhead type, we will have 2 warhead types, is what happens if we discover tomorrow that there's a certain flaw in this warhead and that type doesn't work. You can then switch it out with the other type. Well, if you have sort of 3 interoperable warheads, your hedge for your intercontinental ballistic missile can also be your hedge for your submarine-launched ballistic missile. So that's the direction they're going to. And you actually may have to move in that direction if you want to get to the point where the United States will feel comfortable significantly reducing its number of reserves.
Could you go into more detail about how locking in our relative advantage and knowledge and technical understanding of nuclear explosions and nuclear physics would promote? Because I think part of the argument here is agreeing to reductions relies to some degree on parity. So wouldn't our technical and advantage and technical know-how kind of throw off that?
That might, but here's where I think it's to our advantage. I mean, I think, for example, China. I mean, China has a pretty developed nuclear weapons capability. But, you know, the Chinese are looking at putting multiple warheads on their ballistic missiles. One of the things that requires is significantly reducing the weight of the nuclear explosive package if you want to put, say, 5 warheads on a missile instead of 1. If they can't test, that creates, I think, some concerns. Is that, can they be confident that those weapons would work? Now, they may decide they can, but if they can't, that may slow down their ability to move. Likewise, I think for other new countries, Pakistan, India, just to the extent that we can freeze their nuclear tests, again, we're going to lock them into an area where if they want to do new, more sophisticated designs, smaller warheads that they might want to put, they would put multiple warheads on a missile. Now, they can do that, but they do that without having had the advantage of testing it because the weapon will work. And that's of course a matter of uncertainty where the military says, I really don't want to go down that route. I'll stick with the older system and have more confidence in. So I think that's how that works out in terms of the advantage for us. Now, I think that may be a problem later on if you're talking to these countries about reductions. But that gets into the question, as soon as you start talking about moving beyond numbers into qualitative aspects, it gets really hard to go on as well. Because you start comparing apples and oranges, particularly in a multilateral environment, it's going to be a very, very hard negotiation. And I would say just doing numbers with these 9 countries is going to be hard enough.
Is that a fairly short question? When you're talking about cooperative missile defense and the possibility of like independent systems coming together, and you said that if Russia were to ask the U.S., like NATO's obvious biggest nuclear fear would be Iran, would you say there's what would Russia answer in that?
I don't think the Russians have given an answer officially. Unofficially, what the Russians say is when you talk to them, they say, this may actually be something, they sometimes worry about Pakistan. And I'm not quite sure why I see that threat, but I'm perfectly happy to, I wouldn't mind if the Russians have a bit concern about that. And this does have, I think, some payoffs to the Russians because to the extent it gives them access to data from American early warning satellites at a time when Russian satellites, because of they've had some defense budget problems over the last 2 decades. Their capability of that area has been greatly reduced. So there's a certain advantage to them having that information, even if they're not worried about a specific threat.
Yes, sir. I got another nuts and bolts question. How are strategic and non-strategic weapons defined? It seems like it could be a little bit fuzzy.
Yeah. There is not within NATO, there's no agreed nomenclature. In the book that Mike and I wrote, we decided to use the term strategic and non-strategic. And we basically said strategic is anything that's covered by New START. So warheads for intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, gravity bombs for B-2s, air-launched cruise missiles for B-52s. Non-strategic is everything else. There was actually, I was at a NATO-Russia Track 2 workshop in February, and we tried to define the terminology. And sometimes you can do it by range, but that gets hard to do. For example, an intercontinental ballistic missile is defined by range. If a land-based missile can go 5,500 kilometers, it is defined as an ICBM. For a submarine-launched ballistic missile, to be defined as a SLBM, it only has to go 600 kilometers. So the range categories begin to get crosswalks. The Russians, for years, as I recall, used to argue that American nuclear weapons in Europe, gravity bombs on F-4 Phantom IIs were strategic. Why is that? Because they could strike the Soviet Union. So the terminology issue is really hard. In fact, there's actually, one thing that the United States, Russia, France, Britain, and China are doing in the context of the UN Security Council Permit 5 is they've been tasked for the next non-proliferation treaty review conference of 2015 to come back and talk about some things. And one thing that they're doing right now is just coming up with common terminology. And it's not easy. I mean, the United States and Russia, because we've been talking with the Russians before the Soviets for 40 years about arms control, when we talk about terms like strategic stability, both sides have a pretty good understanding what that means. when you talk to Chinese, the Chinese, well, okay, how does stability work with regards to China? When you have the U.S. and Russia here and China here, how do you make that work? Well, stability tradition has been defined in terms of two countries that have roughly equal forces. So just getting the terminologies right, and it's going to be really interesting if they do to see how they come up with a categorization of nuclear weapons, whether they use range, strategic constructs, whatever.
And thanks for coming. Let me ask you a question about the Senate. So Senator Nunn, you know, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and the four wise men that are against or are talking about zero. And I was just curious about some insights as to how does that play in this debate that's going on in Washington. And then today, are there particular senators that understand what you're talking about, that you guys relate to, and might provide a leadership role for the Senate?
Okay. Well, on the first question on zero, I'm a member of Global Zero. I'm actually part of the minority of people of Global Zero. I approach it from a realistic term. And my realist term is if I define a way to get rid of all nuclear and verify it, I look at that from the point of the United States and say, I've got a friendly neighbor in Canada and Mexico. I've got the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. That's actually a pretty comfortable world compared to, I think, the risks that we face in the nuclear world. But I think if you notice, I mean, President Obama talked a lot about nuclear zero in 2009. That was the Senate plan of his hard speech in April 2009. He doesn't talk much about it now. And I think that's a recognition that it plays badly with the Senate. And you see some of the criticism that comes to whenever he talks about, he talked about reducing the New START levels by 1/3. You know, several Republicans trying to say, aha, this is President Obama going for no nuclear weapons. And the president's backed away from that because he recognizes, one, he's not going to sell it to the Senate, and he's not going to be able to sell it to the Russians. In terms of individual senators, I think one of the real detriments to arms control is people like Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar are gone. They've left. And it's really hard now to look at either side, Democratic or Republican, and say who is somebody, you know, who's the next movement, who's the next one. I mean, the advantage of Lugar, I think, for a lot of Republican senators was, and when you get into the nuclear arms control, this is a pretty arcane subject. And given everything else that a senator has on his or her plate, it's hard to get into this. With somebody like Lugar, I think he gave a lot of comfort to other senators saying, well, you know, I haven't really studied this, I can't read the 500-page treaty, but Lugar's smart, he understands his issues, you know, I can vote because, you know, he supports it. There's nobody like that on the Republican side, and I'd argue that there's nobody like that on the Democratic side. Now, you know, there's been some talk, Bob Corker, who's the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, could he be somebody who would be prepared to make the investment in that? Is there going to be something on the Democratic side that emerges? But it is a problem because the Senate as an institution, and I think this is something that we found in 2010, the knowledge about these arms control questions dropped off a lot in the last 15, 20 years because you didn't have, it wasn't like the 1980s where you had the INF Treaty, you had START 1, you had the joint there, you had the testing treaty. There was a lot more requirement for the Senate to be smarter about these questions. And so one of the things that I got asked to do in 2010 in preparation for the treaty was just to go up and brief staff and basically give a nuclear arms control 101 course to begin to familiarize people because they'd sort of lost the muscle memory. And they got some of it back with New START, but I would think that particularly with a lot of senators in the White House, the president, the vice president, Secretary Kerry, Secretary Hagel, one of the things that they might be thinking about doing is sort of reaching out to some of their former colleagues and trying to cultivate, somebody from each party to be the new Sam Nunn and the new Richard Lugar. Because the absence of people like that is, I think, going to make it harder to sell arms control treaties in the future.
Just to go back to the non-strategic weapons in the book, you 61 strategic, but you mentioned that the Russians don't. They consider those to be non-strategic. And one of the key issues that's come up in the past on non-strategic reductions is the B-61s in Europe are shared.
Yeah.
So it immediately becomes then it's NATO versus Russia, not U.S. versus Russia on the non-strategic side, which is extraordinarily hard to do because Turkey doesn't really want to give up its nukes. So
there are nukes.
yeah. Well, our nukes, but they
Yeah.
it's our hedge against them going nuclear against Iran,
Right.
and that seems to be like a huge stop point for any non-strategic reductions.
Yeah. No, I think one of the issues, first on the non-strategic side is, are the Russians prepared to deal? And so far the Russians have not been prepared. The second question on our side is going to be, at the end of the day, if we can work out an agreement like that big treaty I outlined, I think if we get to that big treaty, if the Russians were ever to agree to come down to, say, 2,500, I'm pretty sure that an absolute Russian ban is going to be all nuclear weapons have to be based on national territory, which would mean the withdrawal of about 200 American bombs that are in Europe. And some of those bombs are designated to use by American aircraft, but some of those are shared in the sense that they're designated for use by Allied aircraft. I would really consider doing that, but here's the problem. When you talk to people in Washington, I have found nobody in the last 3 years who thinks that American nuclear weapons need to be in Europe for purposes of deterring an outside threat. If you look at the Russian military, they're such a pale shadow of what the Soviet military was. But it's not about deterrence, it's about assurance. And that's an issue that you have a number of allies, primarily in Central Europe, Poland, the Baltic states, who, because of historical experience, because of geographic proximity to Russia, are much more suspicious of Russia. And they see those nuclear weapons there as important as a signal of American security here. So that's going to be one of the problems. If we make a lot of progress on this, we're also going to be working that out. Now, part of the other, of course, is the Russians come down to these numbers. The Russians are going to be doing things, reducing and moving some of their tactical weapons that might be reassuring to the Central Europeans. But I think it will be a struggle, and it's going to require a lot of careful diplomacy within NATO if we can for an agreement that calls for the withdrawal of all nuclear weapons to make sure that that's done in a way that doesn't cause a huge amount of angst and unease on the part of Singapore.
Time for one more question.
In terms of this policy, and this is a two-parter, has there been discussion on how the reduction would affect our allies that are under our extended deterrence? In terms of, you're talking about assurance, if we reduce our stockpile, would it reduce their assurance in our terms? I mean, when we talk about Japan or South Korea.
Well, I would divide the problem into two pieces geographically. Japan and South Korea, there were American nuclear weapons in South Korea until 1992. We had American nuclear weapons on naval ships in the Pacific area until 92. We had at least the components to nuclear weapons in Okinawa up until 1972. And then when Okinawa returned to the Japanese administration, we moved Okinawa because of Japan's policy of nuclear weapons. So I think South Korea and Japan have been relatively comfortable over the last 20 years with the idea that the American nuclear deterrent to their countries is provided not by forces in the region, but is provided by U.S.-based systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles. It was no accident that the administration, at the height of the crisis with North Korea and April, chose to fly 2 B-2s over South Korea. And it was a demonstration to North Koreans that we have strategic systems that can get here fairly quickly. So I think that that's not such a big, although there have been some now in South Korea saying that given what's going on in North Korea, we really need to have American nuclear weapons returned. I don't think anybody in Washington is enthusiastic about that at this point. In Europe, it's very different. And part of it is because in Europe, nuclear weapons have been such a visible part of NATO nuclear strategy for the last 4 years. So the question is going to be if you get into an agreement with the Russians or a negotiation, looks like you're going to bring those numbers down, and you're going to want to bring those weapons home. Again, I think if the Allies were okay with that, I think Washington would be ready to pull those weapons out in the next 3 months. So the question is, can you find ways to assure those allies? Now, one will be there will be reductions on the Russian side, which should improve the security situation. Second, are there things that you can do in the non-nuclear that would be assuring? The Baltic states had, I think, a legitimate play about 5 years ago, as they said, okay, if you look at the NATO commander's toolkit, and you look at this contingency, there is no contingency plan for what happens if Latvia gets invaded. Those contingency plans are now there. There's I think this month or next month, there's going to be a 6,000 person military exercise taking place in Poland and Lithuania. And it's a traditional come to defend exercise. So exercise it. The fact that we can demonstrate that we can get significant conventional capability to these countries, I think is reassuring. With missile defense, under the current missile defense plan, there will be American missile defense interceptors based in Romania and Poland. I think that's assuring remains in Poland, because if there are Americans here, if we get attacked, there's a good chance those Americans get killed. That's useful in terms of ensuring that the American military is on our side. There may be other things that you can do. Right now, air policing for the Baltic states. Individual NATO countries, for 4 to 6 weeks at a time, deploy a squadron of aircraft into the Baltics to basically do their air security. And so it'll be the Germans for 6 weeks, and the Danes go in, and the Americans go in. Are there things that you could do like that again would begin to build links that would raise their assurance levels so that they don't have to see these new weapons as such important symbols? And so I think that's one of the things that NATO might be thinking through now, in anticipation that there might be either an arms control agreement or in anticipation that for some domestic reasons that there may be pressures within Europe to reduce nuclear weapons.
Well, I think you'll agree there could be it's hard to imagine a more effective short crash course in these matters than we've had today. So, Steve, thank you very much.